DCE first, the general principles of writing. DCE-01, Block first, Unit 4, the authorial voice. 4.0 Aims and Objective. In this unit, you will learn to identify the author's voice, without which it is never possible to plumb his deeper meaning. An author has several choices to open to him. He may speak directly to the reader, the autobiographical or direct mode. He may communicate with his reader through an intermediary, an imaginary character. He may also exercise his privilege as an omniscient creator who comments openly on his characters' thoughts and emotions, telling the reader all that has to be known about a situation, scene, or character. What is of basic importance is the need to listen carefully to an author's distinctive manner of speaking in order to understand the impulsion behind his writing. 4.1 Introduction. In the previous unit, we discussed the importance of authenticity and credibility in creative writing. Unless a writer makes his story, characters, and situations lifelike, he will not be able to establish any rapport with his readers. Often, story writers and novelists announce on the first page that all the characters and scenes are purely imaginary, and any correspondence with person, living or dead, is purely coincidental. But in actuality, this is only a subterfuge, because as Somerset Maugham has rightly observed, no writer can project anything intensely moving out of his imagination alone. Most writing is in fact either veiled autobiography or is based on the experience of someone very close to the writer. This is what lends an aura of verisimilitude to any successful writing. It is therefore necessary for you to understand how an author's voice can be heard by the reader, even when he writes in the third person using the indirect method of narration. 4.2 The author's voice, how to visualize it. When you read a story, a feature article, a poem, or a play, don't you feel as though you are hearing the author's voice? This is because every piece of writing is sort of utterance. Herein, the writer addresses his reader in the distinctive manner of his speech, directly in his own voice or indirectly through a person created by him. If you are imaginative enough, you should be able to conjure up his voice in your mind's ears. You should be able to conjure up his voice in your mind's ear. You may then interpret this voice as being compassionate or bellicose, tender, or abrasive. The voice becomes immediately recognizable if the writing is done in the first place, first person singular, in the autobiographical or confessional mode. There is here no intermediary between the writer and the reader. The writing then reads like an intimate dialogue between the two. Even if a writer chooses the indirect method of narration, a sensitive reader should still be able to recognize the author's voice as it filters through his imaginary characters, particularly his protagonist. The art of narration may, therefore, be described as a triangle operation involving the teller, reader, and the tale. It is often said that we should trust the tale and not the teller. But then, isn't the story the creation of writer who has his own predilections? How can one therefore ignore the elements of subjectivity in any form of writing? The author's voice will come through in spite of his masked objectivity. So as a writer you should not strain too hard to suppress your natural voice. Be your honest self, write freely and boldly, letting your heart speak the truth and nothing but the truth. If you are speaking with somebody else's voice, strutting about in borrowed plums, you'll be find out soon and your writing will never ring authentic. 4.3 Modes of direct address. We will now analyze the diverse narrative strategies adopted by writer to address his reader. 4.3.1 The direct method or the autobiographical mode. As mentioned above, this method of writing enables the writer to speak directly to his reader as though he is talking intimately to a confidant in an informal conversational manner. A writer may use this method as a therapeutic exercise to shed his sickness, to quote D.H. Lawrence. In this form of writing, the author just wishes to unload his agonies or joys on his reader, who therefore becomes his co-sharer. Haven't we often felt the irrepressible urge to unburden ourselves of something that lies like heavy plumber on our minds? I should advise you at this point to read the opening chapter of Tolstoy's famous novel Klyuz's Sonata to see how the protagonist, who is in fact the author's prototype, shares his personal agony with his fellow passengers. But a beginner should be wary of speaking out in his own voice too often. Even though this kind of writing seems to be much too easy and effortless, if not judicially controlled and skillfully organized, an autobiographical form of writing may lapse into mawkish sentimentality. Such a writer often feels tempted to even fabricate characters who are only thinly veiled extensions of his personal self. A discerning reader, however, should not have difficulty in perceiving a falsity of tone in the author's voice. 4.3.2 The author's voice in diary writing. There is marked difference between author's voice in a narrative sketch and the diary. Read the following excerpt from the diary as carefully as possible. Awoke this morning at 6, went for a walk, had my breakfast at 8, an egg omelette, a cup of milk and an apple. Went to office at 10, worked continuously till 5. With an hour's break for lunch, the day would have ended blankly except for the evening party at the Pandays. It was a large crowd and the usually din of gossip about weather, taxes, and TV serials. And then she swung in, like a swan dressed in a translucent sari, her ebony hair cascading down her sensuous shoulders. But it was her voice that held me, a mellifluous, husky voice with its tantalizing pauses and whispers. What's there about a woman that casts a spell over you? Her dress, her hair, or her voice? After I returned home, I couldn't help thinking of her, even dreamt about her. If you compare this diary note with autobiographical sketch by Kamala Das, cited above, you should be able to distinguish between the two voices. Whereas Kamala Das's voice gives this impression of steady flow, the excerpt from the diary sounds like a stutter, jumbled and incoherent, as though the author is blabbering away. It's only towards the end that the diarist's voice seems to be controlled by a dominant emotion, love or infatuation. 4.3.3 The direct mode used through an imaginary character. If a writer wishes not to speak directly to his reader so as not to let him on his private feelings or for any other reasons, he may, as a subterfuge, create an imaginary character and use him as his channel of expression. This mode offers the writer a double advantage: the security of privacy without the loss of intimacy of direct speech. This is how Graham Greene uses this strategy in his story, A Day Slaved. I had stuck closely to him as people say, like a shadow, but that's absurd. I'm no shadow. You can feel me, touch me, hear me, smell me. I'm Robinson. Having created this imaginary character, Graham Greene now lends him a writer's traits, his own: close observation, curiosity, and concerns for exactitude. Presently, we came to Railway Bridge, and underneath it, he met a friend. I am using words again very inexactly. Bear with me. I try to be exact. I pray to be exact. 4.4 Author's voice with partial omniscience. We may also now consider the voice of an author who feigns only partial omniscience. This is obviously a device to win the reader's trust. In this form of writing, the author speaks with humility, even ignorance, to seek the reader's help in resolving some problem. That is the character's inscrutable motivation. This is again only a strategy because the writer is otherwise supposed to know everything. He is all-knowing creator. To understand this point, let's examine the closing paragraph of Somerset Maugham's story, The Kite, in which the protagonist divorces his wife because she fails to share with her husband the joy of kite flying. The story ends with the author's own reflections. I don't know, I mused. You see, I don't know a thing about flying a kite. Perhaps it gives him a sense of power as he watches it soaring towards the clouds and of mastery over the elements. 4.5 The all knowing author, his voice. As I explained above, every author is all knowing even when he pretends to be only partially so. Every writing is shaped and controlled by its creator's vision. No wonder creative writing is often described as a sort of divine activity. But even if an author prefers to remain invisible behind his work, the reader can still hear his voice between the lines. This voice often carries the rings of the absolute authority because the author knows his character like the back of his hand. His judgment is therefore infallible, his analysis of motivation is definitive. Note, for instance, the opening paragraph of Saul Bellow's story, A Father to Be. The strangest motion had a way of forcing themselves into Rogin's mind. Just a 31 and a passable looking with short black hair, open forehead. He was a research chemist and his mind was generally serious and dependable. What a greater evidence of an author's omniscience is possible than such comments which are designed to let the reader into the innermost recesses of a character's mind. 4.6 Summing up. In this unit, you will have realized that the art of narration is a triangular operation involving the teller, the reader, and the tale. Therefore, it is necessary for you to listen intently to the author's voice to comprehend whether he speaks directly to the reader or through an imaginary character. Direct address can take the following norms. The autobiographical mode. This mode may be used as therapeutic exercise by the writer and diary writing. The author's voice in any mode may be partially omniscient or all knowing. This last choice the writer makes, keeping in view the extent to which he desires the reader to participate in the creative process.